my name is Pawlyn. I'm an architect, and I worked on the Eden projects when I was working with a company called Grimshaw for about 10 years. And then 2 years ago I set up my own company called Exploration. And Exploration is based very much on an emerging principle called biomimicry. Biomimicry is essentially about looking to nature as a source of inspiration for new solutions. And I want to start this evening by posing two questions, two quite big questions that I'd like you to think about over the course of the next 30 minutes. The first one is it possible for us to rethink the way we make things so that all our resources are kept in closed-loop cycles, so nothing is wasted and no pollution is emitted? The second question is it possible for us to transform all our buildings and systems so that they can run completely on current solar income? I'm going to talk about two projects that explore these ideas. And both of them try to propose ways in which man-made systems can start to emulate the closed-loop efficiencies of natural systems. They're both based on biomimicry. The first one is the Plastiki expedition, and the second one is the Sahara Forest project. So, starting with the Plastiki expedition, I think a lot of the images that we see of the ocean imply this sort of feeling of abundance. It implies that there's this healthy system, ecosystem, and everything is just tickety-boo. But the truth, of course, is very different, and our oceans are not in a good state at all. In the Pacific Ocean, there are two vast areas of floating pollution known as the eastern and western garbage patches. And each of these is about the size of Texas. Now, some of that is large-scale floating plastic, which has a significant impact on marine mammals and marine birds. And a lot of it is actually degraded pieces of plastic polymer. So plastic actually breaks down under UV light into very short lengths of polymer. And there's something about the chemistry of polymers that actually absorb toxins from the water and accelerate its uptake into the food chain. So at the moment, Inuit mothers are advised not to breastfeed their children because the level of toxins that is accumulated up the food chain and into their breast milk actually exceeds the level that classifies it as hazardous waste. There's also quite serious problems of ocean acidification. The oceans are gradually getting more acidic, and in November 2006, a group of marine scientists predicted that by 2050, we may well have lost the majority of our major fish species. Here's another statistic that looks pretty alarming. This is based on, I'll tell you what this is in a second, but this is based on 3 studies, all of which are fairly consistent, showing that there's been a dramatic decline heading for a crisis point around 2030. Now that's actually the European male sperm count, and the dotted line there is considered as the threshold of fertility. So this suggests, if these studies are correct and if it's a linear relationship, then this suggests that by 2030 the average European male will be close to sterile. So that's a pretty alarming statistic, and that, I would argue, is a direct result of the way that we currently use resources. We use resources in a very linear, wasteful way, and emitting a lot of pollution. A lot of that ends up in the oceans. And in many ways, the garbage patches in the Pacific, I think, are a very powerful metaphor for the way we treat the oceans. It's as if they've got this limitless capacity to absorb all our pollution. So that was the context in which my client, David de Rothschild, conceived of the Plastiki expedition. David is an adventurer. He founded an organization called Adventure Ecology, which aims to draw attention to a lot of environmental problems through high-profile expeditions, and also draw attention to innovative solutions. So it's not just about pointing at problems, it's also about highlighting solutions. And I've mentioned a number of times already that one of our problems, I think, comes about from the way we make things. We make things in a rather sloppy way. And for me, and for David, one of the most convincing models for how we could rethink this is the cradle-to-cradle model, conceived of by Bill McDonough and Michael Braungart. And the essence of their model is that what we need to do is to completely rethink the way we make things, so that all materials are kept in one of two closed-loop cycles. That's either the biological cycle or it's what they call the technical cycle. So the biological cycle would include all the natural fibers, wood, cotton, and so on. The technical cycle would include all metals and minerals. And one of the real problems that they highlight in the book is that a lot of the things that we make are what they call monstrous hybrids. So it's a combination of a number of different materials put together in a way that makes them virtually impossible to recycle. And there are a lot of good examples. From the boat building industry, a good example would be fiberglass. It's an artificial fiber mixed with an artificial resin. Basically no way you can recover those at the end of that product's life. So most of the waste from shipbuilding industry just ends up in landfill. Currently there's no other way of building boats. So what David was very keen to do with the Plastiki expedition was to draw attention to the garbage patches in the Pacific, but also through the design of the boat to draw attention to some of the solutions. And I worked with David very closely on developing some of these concepts and helped put together the team. There was then quite a big team involving engineers, structural engineers, materials scientists, boat builders, naval architects, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the design development progressed and what some of the ideas were that contributed to the design. Now, one of the first challenges really was to think about how we could turn a very weak material, plastic bottles. David was adamant that this was to be a boat made out of plastic bottles that would sail across the Pacific and then at the end of its life be completely recyclable. So, I hardly need to say this, plastic bottles would not be the first choice of sensible building material for a boat, particularly one that's got to withstand the rigors of the Pacific Ocean. So we thought very carefully about how we could turn something very weak into something very strong. And this is quite a nice example, I think. It's how they used to sell eggs in Japan. So eggs are almost synonymous with fragility. Eggshells are very, very fragile. But actually, if you've ever tried breaking an egg by just squeezing it between your fingers like that, it's impossible. It's very, very strong in that way. So here, what the Japanese did is they packaged the eggs together with a complementary material. So something that was strong in tension together with something that was strong in compression. And together they made quite a robust package. Another source of inspiration came one day when I was slicing up a pomegranate, and I realized that each individual little segment of a pomegranate is pretty weak. You can squash one of those between your fingers. But each one has an internal pressure that presses against the membrane. And by packing them together in a very tight, closely packing geometrical way, by filling all the gaps and then putting a tough skin on the outside, you can produce something that's actually really strong. If you threw a pomegranate at someone, they'd seriously know about it. And this led to quite a breakthrough on the project, because we realized that if we did the equivalent with the bottles, if we pressurized them, then we could immediately turn them into something very strong. And bottles that have been used for soda, for carbonated drinks, they're designed to withstand 5 bars, so 5 times atmospheric pressure. And although it's not all that clear from where you're sitting there, that's a Land Rover standing on top of some pressurized bottles. You can even do it with the bottles standing on end. And when those bottles are at 5 bar, it's like a solid block. It's as hard as a rock.